So, okay. Today is Monday, September 12, 2022. This is the monthly meeting of Climate Action Brookline. And we are going to start with some announcements. And the first, I have two quick announcements and then a couple others as well. The first is that the EDAB, which is the EDAB committee, which is the Economic Development Advisory Board, is having its meeting at 7 o'clock tonight, shortly after we end. And the agenda includes Brookline's compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, which is a housing related issue. And that agenda item will be discussed by Cara Bruton, who's the town planning director. The link to that meeting is on the town calendar. And I'm definitely going to be checking that out after this meeting ends. The next is a fantastic piece of really excellent news, which is that Sustainability Director Tom Barrasso has just announced that Brookline has won a $100,000 Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant from the Massachusetts Executive Office of something of Energy and Environment. The money is going to be used to, quote, provide support for cities and towns in Massachusetts to identify climate hazards, assess vulnerabilities, and develop action plans to improve resilience to climate change. And what that means, folks, is that what we're talking about, we have a new addition coming in, new person. Yep, there we go. Okay. Is that, got to get back to my notes here. What we're talking about is a update to Brookline's climate action plan. Quick perspective. In 2017, Brookline signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, so that in 2018, as Paris asked, Brookline submitted a climate action plan to the Paris people, written by the planning department. And Paris also asked that everybody update their action plan every 5 years. So that means the next action plan is due next year. And basically, the whole purpose of this grant is going to be applied to that project. I recommend we all start thinking about this and urge everyone to think broadly and really to dream. The 5-year update can include everything we insist on. It will include town government. It also will include any and all town, projects or priorities that residents think are worth working on. I'm hoping we can even get school kids of all ages involved. The operant word we've been using in the climate community is that it be comprehensive. People working on that will know what that means. And also, very importantly, that as much as possible, that it be quantitative, that it include specific benchmarks of our design to be worked toward in the area of housing, the area of vehicles, et cetera, okay? This is a huge, fantastic opportunity to let everyone in town realize they have a stake in our climate response. We're going to hear much more about this and get much more involved as time goes on. Basically, just a reminder that the next year's update will be submitted to the climate action plan, to the Paris climate action people, as was the 2018 plan, as Paris asks. And the whole idea is that what we could do then is compare ourselves to peer communities worldwide. So that is excellent news. And our next announcement.
Sorry, John, can I ask a question about that?
Yes, please.
So is it going to be staff led? Because I don't see the ZAB committee doing that. Is that what the plan is?
Well, I'll tell you what, it is. The money has just been, the grant has just been approved. Tom Barrasso is really enthusiastic about it. We've been kind of working with him on that to head in this direction. Everything about it, Linda, I guess I would say, is kind of up to all of us. Everything about it. And I think it's reasonable to assume that, the town staff led by Tom will, take a leading role. But I think advocacy groups like Climate Action Brookline, Mothers Out Front, any ECA, Elders Climate Action people in Brookline who want to get, anybody who wants to get involved. I know there are environmental clubs in the schools. I know there are environmentally related teachers in several of the schools. The whole thing is what we want to make of it. And Paris, by the way, has no requirements whatsoever. It's for every municipality worldwide, these climate action plans are what we want them to be. So I propose that we use it as a huge engagement opportunity and enthusiasm generating opportunity, you know? So, but hey, you know, Linda, I will say that the advisory committee has not had enough work, and we're hoping that advisory, I'm kidding. Advisory
Yeah,
gets
46
an awful
more
lot more work,
articles.
and that's just
Yeah.
what it needs. Okay, next announcement, Patty Correa, Brookline Day, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm having technical problems with my camera, so I apologize. And I'm trying to share something. I thought I had it up. I'm sorry. Hold on. I just had it. Well, I'm going to proceed without it. I had a flyer that I was going to show you for a Brookline Day event, co-sponsored by Climate Action Brookline, Biking Brookline, Mothers Out Front, and ZIAB. It's an EV meetup and information table. We'll have at least 12, hopefully more, combination of cars, bikes, and scooters, including John, attend to answer your questions about EVs. And we're going to have an information table. I've put together a website with information, all kinds of information about EVs, bikes, scooters, cars. Including information on rebates and incentives under the major federal and state climate legislation that was just passed. So that is this Sunday, Brookline Day, Webster Street parking lot, 11 to 3. Hope to see you. Feel free to pass on the news.
Fantastic. Yep, I'll be there with my electric scooter to show everybody. And our next announcement is Susan Martin, also on Brookline Day. Susan.
Yes, so this is from Mothers Out Front. They will be helping the Department of Public Works with staffing waste sites on Brookline Day. And as Patty says, it's Sunday, September 18th, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. There are going to be 10 waste stations around the event, and they are looking for volunteers to help staff those. So I'm putting a link to the Sign Up Genius for that in the chat. And if anyone is able to volunteer, please sign up.
Okay, thank you. With that, I think we're ready for our topic of the evening, which is this. In the last month, CAB received 4 proposals for topics for tonight's monthly meeting. You know, with the increase in extreme heat, forest fires, and floods, climate issues are heating up, no pun intended, I guess, and with many more Brookliners working on climate issues and increasing all the time. Because of the likelihood of housing-related warrant articles coming up at the November town meeting, the topic of the 4 that seemed to have the greatest urgency was the issue of the climate impact of housing development in Brookline. The idea tonight is not to talk about specific warrant articles, but because actually the warrant has not yet been even officially released, but to present overall background on the relevant issues behind the issue of housing development. Knowing that the issue is disputed in town, we invited 2 groups to present the 2 what we thought were the 2 poles of opinion. Building a Better Brookline, which advocates for a vigorous housing development program, and Brookline by Design, which recommends a more cautious approach centered on comprehensive planning, as I understand that. To my great disappointment, Building a Better Brookline declined the invitation, but Brookline by Design accepted. The resultant agenda of the evening is not intended in any way to imply a CAB preference for either camp, and should not be taken that way. No votes will be taken this evening. This meeting is intended for educational purposes only. So with that, I present Linda Pelkey, founding board member of Brookline by Design. And Linda, I know you have a bunch of slides, and you are welcome to share those slides.
Let's try to get them up here. Okay, can people see that? And people can hear me?
Yep.
All right, okay. So thank you, John and Climate Action Brookline, for inviting us to present our thoughts on climate and housing. I'm Linda Olson Pelkey, a professional urban planner and town meeting member from Precinct 17. And as John said, I am on the steering committee of Brookline by Design, and I'm here with Gina Hahn, who is also on the steering committee of Brookline by Design and is a Precinct 3 town meeting member. I want to say up front that we agree that compact multifamily housing near transit is climate positive and that housing affordability is a critical issue. I'll be presenting some data that supports that claim, but we also want to highlight some other climate goals and impacts that we feel should factor into our decision-making as well. In other words, I'm going to try to complicate people's thinking a little bit on this topic. So our existing urban form with its compact development and transit accessibility already creates significant climate benefits, which can be seen in this carbon footprint calculation. With my friends from the old climate committee may recognize that Alan Leviton and I worked on this. And what we found out, now these are just estimates, and I know it's not perfect, but when we did the greenhouse gas inventory, we used some transportation data to calculate household carbon footprint. And that number is down at the bottom of this chart. It's close to 29,000 pounds of CO2 per household per year. Now, this was done a number of years ago, so it's probably changed a bit. And at that time, the national average household carbon footprint was 54,000 pounds per year. So ours is almost, a little bit more than half of the national average, which I think does speak to the climate benefits of our existing urban form. So in the most recent census data that we have, which is, by the way, before the pandemic, it ends in 2020. It shows that for Brookline residents in their travel to work, only 35% drove. 27% took public transportation and 22% walked or biked. But work trips only account for about 20% of the daily trips people make. So we need to keep in mind that as we plan our future neighborhoods, we need to make sure that residents can meet most of their daily needs without a car. Okay. We already have a lot of residential density around our T stations. This map shows the St. Paul stop on the C line, which has an average residential density of 26 units per acre. A rule of thumb in planning is that the density required to support public transit is 15 dwelling units per acre. And coincidentally, that is also the standard that the state has put into their MBTA zoning requirements, that whatever zone gets designated to meet their goals, it needs to have at least 15 dwelling units per acre. Much of North Brookline is already meets or exceeds this level of density. So besides work trips, as I mentioned, the other factor contributing to our positive household carbon footprint is the mix of land uses that we have. We have shops, recreation, places of worship, parks, civic and municipal institutions nearby, allowing for walkability and quick and easy access for most daily needs. When planning future land use, it's imperative that we retain a robust mix of uses near our neighborhoods and not allow our limited commercially zoned land to be converted to all residential, because we would lose this mix. Besides planning for complete neighborhoods, we also should be mitigating the impacts of climate change. Our urban forest climate resiliency master plan, which was recently completed by the Parks Division, it documents the heat island impacts in town, showing that some parts of Brookline suffer greatly from this impact. This chart, the comparison is the baseline degrees on the map on my left is 90 degrees and the one on the right is 100 degrees. And it shows the added 5 degrees in the way that it impacts you and the way that it feels if you're living in a heat island neighborhood. And we can, by planting more trees and having more green space in those areas, we can work to mitigate that impact. It's a public health issue, and it's also an environmental justice issue. So green infrastructure, such as rain gardens, parks and open space, and permeable pavement can help mitigate flooding from severe weather events. Many of these greening strategies could be incorporated into our land use as part of a community-based zoning reform effort. Widespread redevelopment, which would happen if we significantly increase the building capacity of our current zoning, could cause a great deal of demolition and redevelopment, which is very wasteful from a carbon perspective. We need to consider ways to restore and reuse existing structures to diminish this negative environmental consequence. Additionally, demolition of existing structures would cause displacement of residents living in our more moderately priced older housing. A more thoughtful approach would be to allow more units in existing structures while incentivizing keeping the existing building intact. I came across this interesting scientific research that was presented at the World Economic Forum that found that cities like Paris, which are described as low-rise but dense, are better for the climate than cities like New York with its skyscrapers because of the large amount of energy required to construct and operate very tall buildings. Lower building heights also allow innovative, less energy intensive building techniques such as all wood buildings. So this is one of my favorite slides that I've used for all the presentations about planning, and the phrase "great places don't happen by accident" is kind of the tenet of our group, I would have to say. So Brookline has been benefiting from all of the great planning done by our predecessors, but we could easily destroy these attributes that we all love by overbuilding and not being thoughtful and intentional about maintaining the right balance of elements. We believe we need a community-focused effort to plan for our future, taking all of our many goals around climate, equity, housing, public health, economic development, etc., into consideration as a system. Massachusetts law lays out all of the important elements that must be considered while developing a comprehensive plan for community. And as you can see, housing is just one element of the whole that includes the facilities and services needed to serve new growth, transportation, infrastructure, open space, and historic resources. There are many positive benefits to working towards a more modern zoning bylaw, such as more predictable and better designed outcomes, more funding for public benefits, and a more well-designed environment. But we can't really do the zoning reform work until we determine our goals and vision for our future as a community. So one important zoning innovation that I believe we really need to focus on is using form-based zoning. And this is illustrated in these two pictures, which the picture with the flat facade and the no trees, that is what's considered standard Euclidean zoning, meaning that it doesn't really talk about how a building meets the public realm. But form-based zoning is very focused on that and makes sure that the public realm that's created by new buildings is supportive of walking and a welcoming green public space. And here are some examples of zoning innovations that have been used to plan and zone for greater climate resiliency. And these examples are from Somerville, Cambridge, Norfolk, Virginia. And they address everything from favoring native plants to managing stormwater, supporting vital habitat, and improving air quality. So these are just some ideas of how to incorporate resiliency into our zoning. And with that, that is the end of my presentation, and we really look forward to hearing your comments and questions. So thank you.
I can't see everyone on my screen at the same time. So if you have a question, please use the yellow hand or blue hand or whatever. Just so we get to people in time. And while we wait for the first yellow or blue hand, Linda, let me just ask now, form-based zoning, what I saw in that slide, the difference I saw is once the first slide, no trees, the second slide had trees. What else distinguishes form-based from the more standard zoning thing?
Well, you might have noticed there was sort of a consistent design with the storefronts, and they had those awnings. That would be considered part of the zoning. There was also a wider sidewalk and more public amenities such as benches, and all of those elements can be kind of baked into our zoning, which right now, because it's from 1965, it just was not a possibility. It wasn't considered. Those are things that are kind of negotiated on an ad hoc basis. But if you do that parcel by parcel, you're not going to get that uniform facade and streetscape. Yeah, I don't know if Gina wanted to add anything more to that, but.
No, not really. I mean, I think that's pretty much the uniform streetscape. I think is one of the things that's really notable about it. And Linda, does complete streets also kind of tie into that as well in form-based? So when
it's a little tricky because funding infrastructure is separate usually, but you could have linkage payments, and you can also have kind of a design for where you think you're going with your. You might remember from the Boylston Street zoning discussion, there was a lot of talk about how to transform the street. And they were really two different considerations, but in my opinion, that, we're never going to improve Boylston Street unless we can do something to change Route 9, because it's just such a hostile environment to be in. And you want wider sidewalks and more pedestrian benefits.
Mhm.
Other questions of anybody? I think I see Mary D. And again, I can't see everybody. So so Mary D, and then I see a yellow hand from Diane Sokol. So Mary first, please.
Yes, Linda, would you be able to talk more about the reuse as a zoning, how zoning would articulate reuse and eliminating embodied carbon and making it a greener solution? How do we work that into a new zoning program?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky because we've had in the past an attorney general ruling that said that you have to treat all properties the same. But the way I imagine it kind of working would be allowing an additional unit or more than additional unit, like say it's a 2-family house that's in the T zone. And so it's only allowed to have 2 units, but somebody wants to redevelop it. Now, either they're going to here's what's happening now. They tear it down and we get a giant box that has 2 units, an elevator, and costs $3 million. And nobody likes this outcome. I mean, we've seen it over and I mean, every discussion I've ever been in about housing, nobody favors that outcome. So one way to try to retain the existing structure would just be to let, it be kind of a quid pro quo where they're saying, okay, we're not tearing the building down, we're going to rehab the building, but we're going to add allow them internally to add additional units. So maybe it'll work out financially for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then can I ask another question, or do other people have questions?
Well, there are some hands up.
There are a couple. Yeah, sorry. Okay, go ahead. I'll circle back later.
Okay, Diane, yellow hand. Hi, Diane, you are muted. Don't forget that. I'll tell you what, we'll come back to Diane, and Bob Miller, you are also muted, but you're the next yellow hand.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks, Linda, for the presentation. I was just curious about the how you think the comparison of height in Paris versus New York plays out in Brookline, because you know, the issue of density, you know, is you know, very much related to that. And if we didn't have, you know, higher buildings closer together, we would have South Brookline. And, you know, I'm wondering, you know, there's many places where we have, you know, a single-story building next to a 10-story building. And I'm just wondering, you know, what your perspective is on that issue of height and how that plays out in Brookline's growth.
Well, I clearly don't have all the answers, but what it kind of meant to me was I was just really surprised by that finding. And I think we should think about density a little bit more along the lines of compact development, because that's the piece of it that's really making all of these short trips and mixed use and walkability. That's really what's making that work, is things are not spread out land wise, right? So there's sort of two questions. There's like how much is on a site height wise, but there's also, you know, things being close together, and having that really help us a lot. So I think there's probably some kind of happy medium in terms of height that would maybe allow us to take advantage of different building techniques and also not be so carbon intensive. And maybe this is what Diane is going to speak to. I don't know. But, you know, once you have to build a steel reinforced structure with underground parking and elevators and HVAC that's all sealed up, that's very energy intensive. So if you're looking at a 4-story building that's a walk up, and how that compares climate wise, even if it's a new building, it's a much less energy intensive thing. So I think this is just something we need to try to keep in mind as we look for areas in town to add additional height and density. You know, we're not opposed to that. Our point of view is that it's done with our eyes wide open and understanding the impacts and understanding whether a certain location has all of those advantages in terms of access to open space and facilities and things like that. So I think it's a meaningful discussion for us to have as you know, we look forward to going forward. I mean, we're getting elevators in, you know, 3-story buildings because developers think that's what people want. And, you know, we could have some say over that. I don't know if that answers your question, Bob, but that's just sort of what I think it means.
Okay, thank you.
Diane Sokol, let's give you another shot there. If you could unmute yourself.
Thanks. Sorry, I was having Wi-Fi problems. My questions are sort of similar to what I said before. You're in New York. I don't think anybody is proposing the density of New York for Brookline, and I don't even think we have the density of Paris in Brookline. So I'm not quite sure what that was.
Well,
but
yeah.
then also, sorry, just one other thing is, you know, like you, I'm seeing a lot of projects at the planning board that, you know, to build just amounts of feet, 4-bedroom buildings with 4 bathrooms. I don't know any way to, I don't think you can discourage that, but what are the ways of encouraging smaller units, affordable units in the country?
What are the incentives for encouraging smaller units? That's the question. You know, I think there's going to have to be some way to sort of incentivize that, because, you know, we have tried, when we first sort of started talking about the parking requirements as an impediment to, you know, additional housing development, we realized that our requirements being uniform from small units to larger units was making it impossible to ever get small units built. But then when we changed it, the developers didn't change. So there's something else, you know, besides having to build and pay for the parking that's preventing them from wanting to do the smaller units. And I think that's a lot of pro forma financial calculations to try to figure that out. And I think there are going to be ways to incentivize it. But yeah, it's a problem because there's a real disconnect between what the developers think the market is in Brookline and what we as a public policy point of view want to see get done. And I think it's a very challenging question, but it's one that we're going to need to tackle. Absolutely. I mean, we've permitted the micro units. We've seen one 40B with micro units, but we haven't seen any 40A, under our existing zoning being built yet.
All right, Don Weitzman, yellow hand.
Yeah, Linda, thank you so much for this presentation. A slightly provocative question, perhaps. Most of us here, if not all of us, are politically active on a lot of fronts. And my interest these days, just, I guess, from an intellectual point of view, is the intersectionality of various movements and causes. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about how we see the intersection of climate issues with social justice issues, and how this plays out in comprehensive planning, in form-based zoning, whatever, but where there are common interests in both of these perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think definitely the heat island and kind of environmental justice issues, I think, are very real. And I would like to see us take that very seriously, that there are areas in town where people clearly suffer from not having access to green space and having excessive heat conditions, and maybe they don't even have air conditioning. I don't know. So, our areas with a lot of public housing, our areas like right smack dab in Coolidge Corner with everything is pavement. We should be working to mitigate those impacts and evening out the, who benefits and who suffers from those. As far as, we are definitely, I can say, with Brookline by Design, we're incredibly supportive of affordable housing efforts. We all supported the recent work that went into getting the Colonel Floyd project off the ground with the passive house building standards and adding more units. We have also passed the CPA, and the CPA is going to give us additional funding to go to the Housing Trust Fund. And, maybe we need to do more work on homelessness prevention. I mean, we have our Pine Street Inn with the single occupancy housing that's really, really important to help people stabilize and have a secure place to live without being able to afford, their whole new apartments and stuff. I do not think that simply building a whole bunch more housing is going to change the racial demographic of our town. I don't see how you control that. I think with the costs that we're looking at right now, it's just really, really challenging unless it's publicly subsidized, or if we get more creative as a town, utilizing things like community land trusts and getting our community development group, Brookline Improvement Coalition, to think more creatively about how to, cobble together the subsidies and financing, or maybe just focusing on purchasing existing housing and converting it to affordable. But those are the kind of things that I think we should be focused on, rather than just this, build, build, build mantra, because the market is kind of dictating what gets built.
Can I follow up with a comment
Mm-hmm.
about scale and what architectural features do for people?
Mm-hmm.
This is somewhat intangible, but we're affected by the way buildings look, by their size, by the sunlight and so forth.
Mhm.
There was an email recently that used the phrase architectural snobs. And it took me a little bit back, thinking about that. But, and then I think about Ringe Towers. And
What's that? What's,
Yeah,
Ringe
no,
Towers in tall warehouse
Concrete
affordable housing developments
plaza.
in Cambridge,
the one at Fresh Pond.
which look,
Mhm.
which feel very inhuman.
Yes.
And I keep thinking that that needier people also need sunlight and green space and roof lines that make us feel good, and just those kind of psychological environmental impacts.
Mhm.
I hope this doesn't sound too touchy-feely, but I don't know how you get that into the conversation, but I think that's important.
Yeah, it's very real. One way that I've seen that done kind of in planning processes is just to send people out with cameras, photograph things that you like in along streets or streetscapes or whatever. And you start seeing the elements that are de-stressed, comfortable, pleasing streetscapes. And that's what comes back to you. And then you can talk about, well, why is this making you feel that way? And there's so much research done in environmental psychology now that supports that. And I don't think we have to sacrifice that. I hope we don't, because I think that's a lot of why people love Brookline, besides proximity and trees. And, I think it is the look and feel of Brookline. We had a big argument about losing our historic streetscape signs, if you remember. And, I was very adamant that those contribute to the look and feel of Brookline. They're part of our history that, so yeah, that's intangible. And, but I don't think it should just be ignored. So I agree with you, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Susan Martin.
Linda, thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm clear. Is the goal of Brookline by Design really to recast the zoning requirements? Is that what you're ultimately going for? And
That would be the end product, but
that would
go
be
ahead.
the end product.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And could you just give a very brief zoning 101 to those of us who are not familiar with it?
Okay, but I'm gonna go back and answer your first question a little
Okay.
bit more. So, we passed this warrant article at town meeting about wanting the town to undertake a community-driven comprehensive planning process. And the reason for that is that all of these, now we have all these different groups, and there's a lot of advocacy and a lot of concern and a lot of issues that we want to tackle. But we really feel like they can't be tackled in isolation, because whatever you do in one realm, it impacts the other realm, and that we need to go into this with our eyes wide open. So in order to change, to do zoning reform on the end of it, that is a way of implementing the vision and the goals that came out of that planning process, which is people talking together, people setting priorities, people making compromises, people understanding what the trade-offs are in these decisions that we're making. So yeah, the ultimate goal would be to translate the plan into the reformed zoning. And in the rest of the world, in the rest of the United States, this is what states and cities and towns do all the time. We just don't do it in Massachusetts for some bizarre historical reason that I don't understand. So in most other states, I've worked in 4 different states as a planner. And in those 3 other states, there were requirements for comprehensive planning. And there were requirements that the zoning reflects that plan. And that the plan is in conformance with the regional plan, and the regional plan is in conformance with the state plan. We have 0 of that. So I understand why people don't have a lot of faith in it. or understand what it can do for us, or, really want to, join in the process wholeheartedly, because there's this reticence that it's not something real. So, what was your second question?
Just to give a very brief.
Oh,
overview.
zoning 101.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing that zoning would do is divide up the land area in town into different use categories. So for instance, we have a single family residential zoning district, and that's the only thing that can be built in that district. There's, and then we have one that allows single families to also be two families. And then we have a two-family district. And then we have a general business district, which is much more open-ended, but that's our commercial areas. And so there's that first thing. And that's because zoning was kind of born out of wanting to separate uses, because in the long ago, dirty, dark past, people were living next to, tanning operations for leather, or smokestack businesses, and all slaughterhouses. We could be anywhere. So it became this logical assumption that uses needed to be separated. So we went down that road too far, in my view, but that's how it started. But then the other thing that zoning does is say, how big can that building be? How tall? How much massing, how many square footage could be built here? It says there has to be setbacks from the lot lines. It has a little bit of an open space requirement depending on which zone you're in. And in Brookline, we have this process where almost every single development needs special permits to waive some of those requirements. And they get granted every single time. So our zoning isn't really doing it for us anymore. It's just not really, like I said about the results of the really super expensive box with the $2-3 million condos, like what did we get as a community benefit out of that? The people who buy it probably like it. And maybe the guy who sold his house for, 10 times what he paid for it liked it, but it's not really furthering our goals.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Justin, please, yellow hand.
Hey, everybody, I'm at my first Climate Action Brookline meeting. I'm not a Brookline resident. I'm an educator in Brookline. I live right next door in Brighton. I'm very involved in development advocacy in Boston through the BPDA and the ZBA and other things, and so know that process well. And I really don't. I'm super curious about how development works in Brookline. And I like, Linda, from your, and I'm sorry I missed the presentation, but I take it from your last answer. There's a lot of similarities between zoning regulations and what goes before the zoning board, and how much relief is sought for projects, but I do have questions about affordability and how affordability works in Brookline to ensure it. And then I guess the other question is, like, what is planning? It's called planning by design, or Brookline.
Oh, Brookline by design, yeah.
Like so a regional affordability, we know that the housing crisis is a regional issue.
Mhm.
And what's your sort of platform on how this role, how this idea fits into regional, regional efforts to create more affordable housing for folks. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Anybody else want to jump in and answer that? Or, I'm willing to talk about the inclusionary zoning. That's where we have to go right now, but. So Brookline has a requirement in our zoning that if you build 4 or more units, you are subject to inclusionary zoning, which means 15% of the units have to be quote unquote affordable. Now, I don't think they're really affordable. In my opinion, 100% of area median income is not affordable. It wouldn't be affordable to me even right now in my life. But that's what we have. So we do have a public housing entity as well, the Brookline Housing Authority. And we have over 2,000 subsidized units where the residents pay 30% of their income, whatever that is, to live there. And we have a lot of onboarding of, residential services and social work and all that. The challenge is how expensive the land is here, how expensive construction is here, how expensive, it's just crazy expensive. And so how do we deal with that? And that's why I brought up the things like the community land trusts and using our CPA funds, because whatever we do, in my opinion, if we want affordable housing, we're going to have to subsidize it somehow. So, and as far as the regional, that is a really interesting issue, because I've been looking a lot at the MBTA community zoning, as you probably have too. And what I have found is that Brookline has met and exceeded all of those metrics that they're wishing to impose on the entire region, by multiple times. So for instance, within the half-mile from the T area, we call it the T-pod because we actually use it as a zoning mechanism to lower parking requirements within the transit area. So within that area, 75% of the housing units are already in buildings with 3 units or more. And the 3 units and more is what the MBTA zoning thing is trying to get people to build. So does it make sense for Brookline to, tear down existing housing and build new? Well, maybe in some places, but I feel that we have to be very careful about where those places are in terms of location and whether they're in a smart location. Like, did it make sense to put affordable housing at the top of Fisher Hill? Well, maybe. I mean, we can talk about that. But, it's, we have done a lot. We have also met our 10% affordable housing, state inventory number. So we have built a lot of housing through 40B in the last decade. It's something like 2,000 units. And I would be very interested to see who are the people that move to that housing. Is it meeting our expectation of who we're building that housing for? Do they come from elsewhere? Are they people of color? What was their situation before? I would love to know that, because that could really help us kind of focus on target audiences, right? So, does the state want Brookline to be more of the solution? Yes. Are they asking us to build more in the already densest parts of town? Yes. Do I think that makes a whole lot of sense? No. And people point to South Brookline, and South Brookline is kind of like a different community. And it's, in order to densify there, we need transit, right? I mean, that's the thing that makes all of this possible in North Brookline. So until the T decides to, plan and expand to South Brookline, we might be able to add some density, but I don't think it can be, like a walkable community or anything like that until we do. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I mean, I've been going around and seeing all the housing being built in Alston, Brighton. It's incredible how much is being built. I mean, when that MAPC first set the goal for the housing production, 90,000 units have been built since then. And the pandemic did really kind of upend everything. People aren't all working downtown anymore. So how about, making satellite communities more of an economic center and focusing more on localizing benefits rather than assuming that we just have to keep building and building and building so that employment growth can continue to build and build and build in Boston and Cambridge. I don't think that's really a sensible model. I mean, we are already crushed with traffic. Our T is wobbling. I mean, I hate to badmouth the tea because I believe in it, but it's really suffering right now. So, you know, I think it's an interesting question. We don't really have a regional plan, right? There isn't one. And it certainly doesn't have any force of law. So it's a bigger question. Where does it make sense to really expand, I think?
Mary D, you had a yellow hand up for a while. Is it still?
Oh, I just took it down. I'll just give it a shot. Linda, you mentioned that buildings are one element of the whole planning process. And you laid out other factors that contribute to a cultural experience, including walking to shopping, public transportation. How do we balance the need for affordable housing and more building with the other elements that make for livable cities, not just because Brookline is an example of a dense city that is, quote, livable and has environmental treasures like street trees or parks. How do we incorporate the drive for equity into a broader based building program? You mentioned subsidizing. I've experienced the zoning board of appeals and the planning board all wrestling with, affordable housing or trying to do renovations that are compatible with existing buildings versus a brand new arty. Someone, the planning board used it as an aggressive design, but somehow design has gotten associated with elitism. But what you're saying, what I hear you saying is that community-based zoning or the comprehensive zoning of other elements actually has some equity elements to it. And I'd just love to hear you speak a little bit more on that.
Well, you know what? I'm thinking that actually Gina might have a really great answer to this question. I mean, I'm willing to take it, but, I'm trying to let my colleague have some comments here. So
Yeah,
I think
I'm
it's a
not sure
good
that my
question.
answer is going to be better than yours, Linda, but I would say that I think kind of what you spoke to earlier, that I think that we do have to look at this as kind of a balanced system. And we do have to think about issues like, walkability to grocery stores, not, inadvertently creating food deserts, things like that are all important parts of it, of making sure that when we are adding housing, we need to make sure that we're giving people access to the things that make a community a livable, walkable place. And as far as doing that goes, I mean, that's part of why I think we're hoping to get the planning process study committee kind of up and going, is that by virtue of doing, a comprehensive plan, we can be looking kind of parcel by parcel and taking the community as a whole to kind of look at how do we and where should we be citing things so that we can create, more kind of robust, comprehensive, real nodes of activity, kind of mixed uses, rather than just, parcel by parcel, letting developers develop them the way that they see fit, which really may not be beneficial to the community as a whole. Linda, do you want to jump in?
Well, the only other thing I would add was just, through the process of doing projections and scenarios and build outs and all those things that you would do in a planning process, it's going to become apparent that if we add, X number of housing units in this area, well, this area is already deficient in open space. Like I live in precinct 17, right across from the Winthrop Park where I take care of the Rose Garden, but that playground is maxed out. Not another kid could fit in that park on a weekend, on a nice weekend. It's just crazy how crowded it is. And it's also the area with the heat island impacts, right? Up by Com Ave and where some of the housing is, some of the affordable housing is. So you have to go into it knowing this situation needs to be remediated. We need to be able to purchase more open space or pocket parks or something to give people in this area access to nature. So that's an expense. And it's something that you have to plan for in our capital improvement program. I mean, we need to go into this with our eyes open about what it's really going to take for, addressing what we perceive as the impacts here. So we had a huge battle at town meeting about plastic turf. Like, why did we argue about plastic turf? Because we don't have enough recreation space. And you want to add 7,000 more people? Well, where are their kids going to recreate? These are things we have to actually talk about and figure out how we're going to solve that problem instead of saying, oh, it'll take care of itself. Because before you know it, we're going to be Alston. I hate to rag on Alston, but I just have to tell you a little funny story. So I was watching the news on move-in day, and they were interviewing a young Black college student moving into Alston. How's it going? What do you think? And he's like, well, last year I lived in Brookline. This is a real downgrade for me. He said this on the television. It's like, but he's just a kid and this is what he perceives. And this kind of gets to, what Don was talking about. Like, is your environment inspiring you and supporting you and uplifting you to be the best you, And this kid didn't think so. He moved from Brookline to Brighton. So anyway, I just can't help but share that little comment. So I don't know if we answered your question, Mary.
Well, it's an ongoing process and I'm
Mhm.
interested in getting it launched and to making it comprehensive and as multidimensional as possible.
Yeah, right to the select board, please.
So Linda, what is exactly the status of that community planning process that your warrant article wanted
Yeah,
to start?
so there was a scope of work for the committee that we, voted to support. So warrant article 26 called for a committee to identify what this planning process should look like, how much should it cost, what are the work programs, what's the time frame, blah, blah, blah. And the select board at their meeting on August 23rd adopted that scope. And there's a list of names of people who have applied to be on it. There's 13 people who have applied. They're looking for 5 to 9 people to work on this. So if anybody, you still have a few minutes to get your name in if you want to be on this little committee. It's not going to last for very long. It literally is just going to, make a proposal for how we should go forward with this. So that's where we're standing right now. We're trying to get the select board to appoint the members to this committee. That's what the holdup is.
Linda, when was that warrant article? Was it last year or earlier?
No, it
than
was
that?
fall 2021.
Okay.
So like a year ago. It was not in the
Okay.
spring. It was in the
Okay.
fall.
Any other questions? Be sure you just put up your yellow hand. And I have a question, which is that the idea of the 15-minute city. I mean, is that
Mhm.
which means that wherever a person lives, that it only takes 15 minutes to get to their shopping, their work, their
Mhm.
school, whatever. So is such an idea possible in Brookline? And
Well,
should
that's
that be
kind
done?
of, yeah, I mean that, I think it's a little rigid in its, typology, but this is what we're talking about with the mixed use and with locating new growth where those support activities already exist. That's it is the same thing. It's I would say I live in a 15-minute city. I can walk to Coolidge Corner and do my shopping and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good concept. It's a little hard to achieve, but it's a good concept.
Justin,
Yeah, sorry, I just couldn't let the Alston comment go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a proud Alston Breton resident, and Alston has suffered from all kinds of corporate malfeasance because all of these people that you're talking about are renters, and
Mhm.
you know, these are large units owned by for-profit, you know, big, you know, this all. So like I know
Yeah,
that
I know. I'm sorry
there's-
about that. It's just one time we had a town meeting member who put 2 aerial photos up for
Yeah, no,
everyone to look at.
absolutely.
Do you
In
remember
fact,
that? Yeah.
Winchester Street is and going into Kelton Street in Alston is a great example of what a difference a tree canopy makes.
Yeah.
And I often think of using it. But like the people, there's also, and this is why I brought it up, like the any reinforcement of a narrative that renters and people who live in Alston and are like aren't engaged, and believe me, that's something that Alston Brighton people also use, and it's very divisive, and it's a real obstacle for engagement in planning and engagement in development. And as somebody who works in that space, I want to try to stomp it out as whenever I hear it, that like renters here, even though they're here for a couple of years, care deeply about where they live and want to do things to improve it. So we know that not everybody will stay in Alston Brighton, but there's not a pathway to doing that right now, and we want to make sure that that narrative really gets killed because it's not real. Thanks.
Well, yeah.
So-
What do you think of the? Sorry, John. I just want to ask you, Justin, what you think of the agreement that was made about the Harvard lands, and did that really benefit the community? Did it work out?
Yeah, that's funny that you should ask it. I'm sort of tangentially involved with that. But the community, the Coalition for a Just Alston Brighton, is a group that sort of grew up to take on Harvard. And man, what Harvard is up to is incredibly difficult and challenging, and it's presenting an enormous amount of problems. For those of you who don't know, Harvard is a massive landowner in Alston, owns 1/3 of all of Alston, most of which was bought secretly in the early 2000s. So there's deep distrust between the residents of Alston and the institution, and we're no longer really relating and working with them as like an institutional neighbor, like with BC or BU or hospitals. It's more like a massive developer that has very unknown aspirations. It owns all this property, and what they're doing is, instead of offering the community a grand vision, a big plan about these dozens and dozens and dozens of acres, it's being rolled out piecemeal, and it's being rolled out through the I'm blanking on the name of the recent developer who did the SEC, the enterprise campus, but so we're not getting a chance to really. It's a mess, and we, there are some glimmers of hope. One of them is, Harvard is now paying for a community needs assessment, which, like you were mentioning earlier, development and planning are backwards. There's not even an institutional, there's not even a master plan for Alston Brighton. And so equipping residents to use those kinds of that data, that assessment, and other things will be helpful. We know the Wu administration is really prioritizing planning, and there's a Green New Deal cabinet position, and the new head of BPDA is a little more a part of the process in Alston, but a lot of people are deeply skeptical, and it is a fight, and there's a lot of residual bad feelings towards Harvard. And I'm not sure if Brookline has those kinds of institutional neighbors. I guess
we have BU. They own a
right?
chunk in Cottage Farm, but it's not the same gorilla that you guys are dealing
Well,
with. So.
BU might have been part of the same gorilla. And as a matter of fact, I live in the Grafton McKay Historic District, and folks who were involved in town issues, what was it, 10, 15 years ago, whatever, know that that district was created very, very quickly. And part of that reason is that the fear of straw buyers
Mhm.
and of buying multiple units under Sam Snead and Bill Jones, and then suddenly
Yeah.
you realize it's really all the same.
Yeah.
And tearing down the local modestly, not humongous housing, and building, well, actually dorms like we have right across Com Ave in Boston.
Mhm.
And so, Justin, I was going to ask you, I mean, you're talking about corporate for-profit landowners of very large buildings in Alston. What would you have instituted to prevent that happening? It sounds like you don't like that happening. How would you have prevented it in an ideal world?
Well, I'm not, that's a great question. I mean, more cooperatives, definitely more home ownership. I'm luckily in a building where there are a lot of the owner occupancy is high. It's about a 28 unit building. It's about 100 years old in the Aberdeen district of Brighton. I mean, it's so funny to do this work and to think about the system and the system, I think, is unable to answer these questions. And really, I look towards completely different models, a lot more social housing. The idea of like a public developer is really interesting to me. And I think that there's like the real, I'm not sure, John, was that you that answered that question? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Tenants unions make a huge difference. And there's actually the Feinberg Tenants Union is very active in Alston. But they receive, it's tenants against NIOP, and they're very powerful lobbyists. And that's not a fair fight. So that continuing to organize and build that kind of power is essential to winning that, and to making sure that, I mean, they simply don't care about the living conditions of these units. They don't care if and when it comes to, this is something that even comes up in my own building. There's the individual unit, and then there's the building. The building needs care. The building needs constant maintenance. And if we're thinking about, the Berto ordinance that requires large buildings like this to come up with a plan for addressing its greenhouse gas emissions, that can only happen. I'm involved with that because I'm really concerned that these large buildings that have dozens and dozens and dozens of units that are owned by, these large for-profit companies, that the costs of dealing with greenhouse gas emissions are going to be passed on to renters.
Right.
So we really want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So there's lots of ways to do this, but I think that the current system just isn't equipped to really meet the needs of the moment.
Well, hopefully the mayor can help change that dynamic a little bit, at least. I think she intends to, so.
Yeah.
Katha Seidman, welcome to CAB.
Thank you. I have a question that's not really related to what we've just been talking about, but it's tangentially related. One of the things think about with a kind of comprehensive plan or any kind of zoning, addressing zoning, is how do we as a town manage its fiscal, being fiscally solid. It right now it's pretty tenuous. And how do we incorporate that project of building up our economic base when we think about zoning, development, whatever, you
Mhm.
know, so one of the, historically, Brookline has been a place where, you know, wealth made outside of town goes to sleep. And the wealth in town is basically embedded in real estate. That we don't really have a big commercial tax base. Our tax base is one of the lowest town, our commercial tax base is one of the lowest in the, you know, sort of suburban Boston area.
Mhm.
And so how do we think about using our future to build that tax base? And, you know, have you, you know, thought about that as you're thinking about any kind of future vision?
Well, it definitely needs to be considered, I would say. I think this is why I mentioned being careful not to redevelop commercial sites with just housing, because we have very little commercially zoned land. And I don't think we want, and we may want to change that. I mean, we may have more commercially zoned land. Like, for instance, people are talking about what's going to happen at the corner of Boylston and Hammond Pond, or Hammond Street, I guess it is. And there is some talk about looking at rezoning that area. And the first proposal, because it is the most lucrative, is to build a giant housing apartment building. And yet the neighborhood and people who think about it say, well, wait a minute, this is an opportunity for significant commercial development. Like, there's those medical office buildings along there, et cetera, maybe more of that. So yeah, I think this is a very important question. This is why we are advocating for a process like this, so that we understand the impacts to our budget of these land use decisions. And, you know, we have this group that we're all going to go to their meeting in a couple hours, EDAB, Economic Development Advisory Board. Historically, their entire mission has been bringing commercial development to Brookline. And we've, you know, I've been involved in that, and we've been kind of successful. We did zoning overlays to allow for the hotels and, you know, all of that. I think that's just a critical question in everything that we do. I don't have the answer to it. Ideally, we would have regional tax base sharing. I mean, why should we house all the people that work in Cambridge? They have a massive commercial tax base. And yet they want us to house all their workers. It's, you know, it's a problem. It's a problem. But it's a very, very good question.
Well, I think I just want to sort of push back a little bit about the regional piece, because, you know, Brookline has historically decided that it didn't want to develop its commercial tax base. So there's a certain amount of, you know, we don't really have a huge leg to stand on when we talk about that. I do agree that more, you know, regional coordination would be useful, but I'm not sure that, you know, Somerville, for example, which is an incredibly dense city, has always been an incredibly dense city, also figured out, you know, got really lucky at areas that didn't have public transportation now have lots of public transportation, and they've been able to completely capitalize on that and use, you know, Assembly Square, for example, which didn't do before. So, you know, that's a complicated thing. And I think Brookline's going to have to figure out its own, get its own house in order to be able to sort of say to a regional group, hey, we've done the best we can. Now let's talk about how to share that wealth that, you know, is made in say Boston, that, you know, where that goes to sleep in Brookline, that, you know, that income, because there's wealth and income. And so anyway, I think it's I think we have to really deal with it within Brookline, at least as best we can, until we start to say we did it. Now what, you know?
Yeah, Somerville had a redevelopment authority. They had the authority to take properties by eminent domain. They assembled Assembly Square. They put parcels together. You know, are there places we could possibly do that in Brookline? I'm having a hard time coming up with it, but maybe. You
That
know,
maybe,
Yeah.
but they had that available to them and it became viable when they got more public transportation, which they didn't have. And Brookline has always had that and has kind of pulled back from doing the kind of commercial development that Somerville has, you know.
I'm gonna push back on that. I'm not sure it was a conscious decision. I think it's sort of more just a historical land use pattern, but you know, we could argue about that. But I'm wondering if someone like Paul has a comment on this, because this is something that we've talked a lot about. I mean, I worked with Paul and other people, and we brought that voluntary wealth tax to town meeting, for instance. It is an issue. How do you support the town in its needs for revenue? And when you have very high, you know, property values, et cetera, so.
Well, I'll just mention that we do have that in place. I haven't made a big effort to talk with the wealthy people in Brookline, some of whom I had talked with before about it. But that's where the wealth is in Brookline, and it's not in real estate. It's not in Brookline real estate. It's in the net worth of very wealthy people. And just the kind of the ultimate example probably is Bob Kraft. His family has about $40 million of Brookline real estate. So they pay about $400,000 a year in taxes to Brookline. That's about 1%. We all pay somewhere close to 1% of our property value as property tax to Brookline. Well, but his net worth is $4 billion. If he paid 1% of his net worth, it would be $40 million a year. That's the difference between paying $400,000 a year and paying $40 million a year. But I don't know how the town can, you know, all we need is some of that money would be really helpful, but I don't know how we get it yet.
I don't think the town has the capacity to tax income. I don't think
No, we don't.
That's
why
not
we did it voluntary.
I mean, what is happening now in terms of taxing the wealthy is, of course, the fair share amendment that's going to be on the ballot in November. And if that passes, then there will be a fair amount of money from people who are making over $1 million a year in income that will then go to education and transportation. But that, as far as I know, that won't have any impact one way or the other on housing.
That's true.
Justin,
Yeah, sorry, Paul,
don't
just,
apologize. It's fantastic.
I was gonna ask that very question. I don't know if Brookline by Design, I know, I just checked out your webpage. I noticed that you got some electoral endorsements, and I didn't know if you endorsed the fair share amendment at all. And
Yeah, we haven't voted. That's not kind of in our ballpark, but I'll tell you, I'm a rabid supporter of it, and I collected signatures to get it on the ballot. So yes.
to hear.
Any other questions? We've asked folks to stay till 6:30. We're 8 minutes short of that. So other questions are more than welcome. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. So
Thank you for asking us.
yeah, okay. I'll tell you what, again, remember, and Justin, to let you know in particular, and everybody else, is that this meeting is being recorded. So anything you missed, you'll be able to catch. Just send me an email if I forget to get the link to that recording to you in a timely way. So I would like to remind folks of a couple of things. First of all, at 7 o'clock tonight, about 45 minutes or so from now, the EDAB, the Economic Development Advisory Board, is having a meeting, and the issue of the MBTA Communities Act is on the agenda. That discussion will be led by Cara Bruton, Brookline's planning director. So that should be a very interesting meeting, and that directly impacts is directly relevant to the things we've been talking about tonight. Want to remind everybody, Brookline Day is this Sunday. Got 2 different volunteer opportunities for everybody. In addition to that, the Climate Action Brookline annual meeting, it will be, I think it's the 2nd Monday in October. And we are planning, which would be Monday, October 10. And we are planning a kind of a big major kind of wrap-up issue. Susan and I are busy in the planning stages of that. I think we've got a
So-
good speaker in mind for that. So, and also, Susan?
Yeah, just to, the 10th
Susan,
is,
yes, go ahead.
the 10th is Indigenous Peoples' Day / Columbus Day, so we may postpone it until the following Monday, the 17th.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for telling me. Yep, got it. Okay, sorry about that. Yep, Monday, October 17th. Thank you very much. And then the November Climate Action Brookline meeting will be warrant article endorsements. Any warrant articles that have environmental implications, those petitioners are welcome to seek a Climate Action Brookline endorsement. And if you are such a petitioner, by the way, this is a fantastic opportunity for you to do a dry run of your script that you intend to announce describe your article on the floor of town meeting. So, I think we're very
There's
good.
a warrant
Anybody else have any-
article to allow beekeeping. I think that's climate related.
I agree with that. That will be very interesting. And also, I am a petitioner of a warrant article to protect trees in the town of Brookline, modeled after similar warrant articles in Cambridge and Concord, Mass, and I think Somerville, and also definitely Concord, Massachusetts. So that will also have some great interest, I hope. So,
And John, does
any other final comments? Yes, Gina.
does
please.
your warrant article, does it address kind of trees in terms of development and things and kind of clear cutting lots, or is it?
Mhm. Yeah.
That's the entire idea. And there has been a tree protection committee in existence now for, I'm going to say, 5 years or more. And that committee got kind of stalled on the issue of how to pay for additional inspections to inspect lots, before trees are cut down, et cetera, et cetera. And Jocelyn Murphy, the super lead petitioner on it, discovered that the city or town, I guess, of Concord, Mass, pays for those additional inspections through the permit fees of the people who are applying to cut down these trees. So it's a kind of self-funding mechanism. And this, we're hoping, will break through the logjam. Again, sorry about the pun, but that has prevented that from moving forward in the town of Brookline. Mayim is asking the date of the warrant article review, and November 14th is in fact the 2nd Monday of November, and that will be just a week or so before town meeting proper. So that unless that's a major holiday, that will be the date. So, all right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to keep the meeting open for a few minutes longer so I can catch everything that came in on chat. But I think unless anybody has any final wrap-up remarks, how about you, Linda? Are you in good shape, or anything final to tell us?
No, stay tuned. And if you want this comprehensive planning process to go forward, shoot an email to the select board, tell them to get off their rear ends.
Okay, and Mayim, Chad is saying that's just a day before town meeting. Anybody know the start date of town meeting? I've got it in my other book.
Let me
If
look.
it's just a day before, that's, yeah.
Too close. Yeah, town meeting starts on the 15th of November.
Oh, so Susan, we might want to rethink that date too then. So anyway, we'll get back to you about that. We'll definitely get back to you about that. So, all right, everybody. So why don't we consider this meeting adjourned then? And we'll see you next time. I'm going to keep the meeting open a little more so I can catch the chat, but thank you to everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
And we're
Linda.
ending 3 minutes short of an hour and a half. So good to see everybody. See you next time.